The buzzing sound was the first thing I noticed. Not the fun kind, like a bee in Grandma's garden, but a low, angry hum that lived inside our television. It was the sound of a spaceship battle, full of fake explosions and the frantic mashing of buttons. Jack and Tom were on the floor, cross-legged and so close to the screen that their faces were lit up by blue and red flashes. They were saving a galaxy, they'd told me. Their thumbs moved in a blur, their eyes wide and empty, completely lost in the world behind the glass. I was sitting at the kitchen table, drawing a family of yellow stick-figure suns, each with a different smile. The house was quiet except for the video game. It was a Saturday, one of those gray afternoons where the sky couldn't decide whether to rain or just stay sad. The smell of lemon polish from Mom's morning cleaning still hung in the air, a clean smell that always made me feel a little bit lonely. I wasn't allowed to play the spaceship game. Mom said it was too violent. And besides, there were only 2 controllers. Jack was 10 and Tom was 9, so they were older. That's what they always said. We're older, Lily. It was their reason for everything. Why they got the bigger pieces of cake, why they got to stay up later, and why the 2 controllers belonged to them. I was 8, and I wasn't saving any galaxies. I was just drawing suns. I added a little dog to my sun family, a bouncy one with a curly tail. I was about to give him a name when I heard her footsteps. Mom came into the living room, her arms full of folded laundry. She had a way of walking that was all business, like she was always on her way to fix something that was broken. Her eyes scanned the room, passing over the boys and their spaceship war, and then landing on me. Her lips pressed together into a thin, straight line. It was her disappointed line. I saw it a lot. "Lily," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the sound of the explosions on the screen. Jack and Tom didn't even flinch. "Look at this floor. It's a mess." I looked down. The floor looked like it always did. A little dusty in the corners, a few crumbs near the table from lunch. I didn't think it was a mess. It was just a floor. "While your brothers are busy," she continued, and I wasn't sure if she was being sarcastic, "you could be doing something useful." She dropped the laundry onto a chair and walked over to the broom closet. The door creaked open. "I want you to mop the floor." The words felt heavy. Heavier than the mop she pulled out. Its handle taller than me, its stringy head gray and damp. She handed it to me. My hands were small, and I had to use both of them just to hold it upright. "But why me?" I whispered. The question felt dangerous, like a bubble rising in my chest that I was supposed to keep down. Mom sighed. It was a tired sound, one I heard a lot, too. She gestured with her head towards the television. "They're busy, and you're not doing anything important." She looked at my drawing of the Sun family, and for a second I thought she might say something nice about it. But she didn't. Her eyes went back to me. "Girls should be useful, not lazy." Lazy. The word stung more than if she had shouted it. It felt sticky and wrong. I wasn't lazy. I was drawing. I was making a happy family of suns. How was that lazy? I looked over at my brothers. They were shouting at the screen now, their bodies rocking back and forth. They weren't being useful. They were saving a fake galaxy. But they weren't lazy. I was. "The bucket is in the laundry room," she said, her voice softening a little, as if she knew she'd thrown a rock and was now watching where it landed. Hot water and a little bit of the blue soap. She walked away, leaving me alone with the giant mop and that one word. Lazy. I stood there for a long moment, the rough wood of the handle pressing into my palms. The battle on the television raged on. Red lights flashed across the floor I was supposed to clean. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the mop down and tell her it wasn't fair. Jack and Tom never had to mop. They had to take out the trash, but only when the bag was so full it was about to burst. They never had to clean something that nobody else seemed to think was dirty. But I didn't scream. I just dragged the heavy mop behind me, its dirty strings whispering against the floorboards all the way to the laundry room. I filled the bucket like she said, the hot water making my fingers turn pink. The blue soap smelled strong and chemical, nothing like the lemon polish. It smelled like work. As I pushed the wet mop across the living room floor, my arms started to ache. I had to go around my brothers, who shuffled their legs out of the way without ever looking at me. I was just a ghost in the background of their game. The water sloshed in the bucket. The floor got dark and shiny, then started to dry in dull streaks. With every push and pull, the words echoed in my head. Girls should be useful, not lazy. I didn't understand what it meant to be useful. Did it mean cleaning? Did it mean being quiet? Did it mean not playing games? I didn't know. I just knew that it felt lonely. It felt like being a gray, stringy mop in a world full of colorful, flashing spaceships. It took me almost an hour to finish the floor. My back was sore, and my hands were red and wrinkled from the water. I pushed the bucket back to the laundry room, the dirty water sloshing against the sides. It left little gray trails behind me, and I worried Mom would see them and make me clean all over again. When I was done, I peeked back into the living room. The floor was drying in uneven patches, but my brother's socks were no longer picking up dust bunnies. I had been useful. I felt a tiny, strange flicker of pride, but it was quickly swallowed by the ache in my arms. Jack and Tom were still on the floor, in the exact same spots. They had defeated the alien mothership and were now navigating an asteroid field. The game made a pew-pew-pew sound that was starting to give me a headache. They hadn't noticed the clean floor. They hadn't noticed me at all. Mom came back a few minutes later, holding a cup of tea. She stopped in the middle of the room and looked down. She slid her foot across the tiles, as if testing the surface. Was all she said. She didn't say, "Good job, Lily." She didn't say, "Thank you." She just took a sip of her tea and looked at my drawing of the Sun family, which was still on the table. "You should clear this up now. We need to set the table for dinner soon." And just like that, my usefulness was over. It was a chore, not a contribution. I gathered my crayons and my drawing, my fingers smudging the yellow suns. I folded the paper carefully and put it in my pocket. It felt like a secret I had to keep. That Saturday set the rhythm for all the weekends that followed. While Jack and Tom leveled up in their digital worlds, I was given a string of real-world tasks. I learned how to fold towels so the edges were perfectly aligned, how to dust shelves without knocking over Mom's little glass animals, and how to peel potatoes, the peeler clumsy in my small hands, carving off thick chunks of white flesh along with the skin. "Wasteful, Lily," Mom would say, guiding my hand. "Be careful. Be useful." Each time I would watch my brothers, their faces illuminated by the screen, their shouts of victory or groans of defeat, the constant soundtrack of my chores. Resentment began to build in my chest, a hot, prickly feeling. It wasn't fair. Why did being a girl mean I had to work while they got to play? I started to see the house not as a home, but as a list of jobs. The smudges on the window were a future task. The pile of shoes by the door was a mess I would eventually have to organize. The world of fun, of spaceships and adventures was a locked room, and my brothers had the only keys. One afternoon, I got brave. Jack and Tom had gone to the park with their friends, leaving the television dark and the controllers resting on the floor. The house was silent. It was a rare and precious thing. I tiptoed into the living room and picked up a controller. It felt foreign in my hands, with its smooth plastic and too many buttons. I found the power button on the console and pressed it. The machine whirred to life, and the Spaceship Games title screen flashed onto the television, loud and triumphant. I sat on the floor just like they did and tried to start a game. I didn't know which button to press, so I pressed them all. Nothing happened. I tried again, my heart thumping. I was a spy in my own house on a mission to steal a little bit of their fun. Finally, the screen changed. A spaceship appeared. My spaceship. It was small and silver. I was in the game. I was so focused on trying to figure out how to move the ship that I didn't hear the front door open. "What do you think you're doing?" Mom's voice was sharp as glass. I dropped the controller as if it were on fire. It clattered on the hardwood floor. I was just looking," I stammered. She marched over and turned the television off. The screen went black, silencing the heroic music. "You know the rules, Lily. That game is not for you. It's a mindless, lazy activity. You have better things to do with your time. But Jack and Tom play it all day." The words burst out of me, louder than I intended. "They're not lazy. Why am I lazy for wanting to play for 5 minutes?" Helen's face softened, but not in a kind way. It was a look of pity. "Oh, honey," she said, crouching down in front of me. She tucked a piece of hair behind my ear. "It's different for boys. Nobody thinks twice about a boy wasting his time on silly games. But a girl has to be better than that. You have to be responsible. You have to be useful. It's how you show your worth." She believed it. I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't trying to be mean. She was trying to teach me a lesson she thought was important. She was teaching me how to survive in a world that would judge me differently. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't about a clean floor or a violent video game. This was about being a girl. My mom wasn't just giving me chores. She was giving me my place in the world. And it was a place I didn't want. That night, in my room, I didn't draw suns. I took out a black crayon and drew a tall, thick wall. On one side, I drew 2 boys with controllers, their faces lit up by a bright screen. On the other side, I drew a girl. She was holding a mop, and her shadow stretched long and thin behind her. trapping her in a cage of her own making. Years went by, but the house stayed the same. The only difference was that I grew taller. The mop was no longer a towering giant, but a familiar tool. I could clean the whole house in under 2 hours, my movements efficient and automatic. I became an expert in the silent language of domesticity, the precise amount of bleach to make the whites brighter, the right way to scrub a pan without scratching it, the rhythm of a broom sweeping across the floor. I was 13, and my usefulness was no longer a question. It was an expectation. Jack and Tom were now deep into their teenage years, their voices lower, their presence in the house somehow both larger and more distant. Their digital battles had evolved into complex online worlds with teams and strategies I couldn't begin to understand. They spoke a language of acronyms and player tags, their victories and defeats still echoing through the walls. But now they were shared with a legion of unseen friends across the internet. They were part of a world. I was in charge of the house they lived in. Mom's praise remained as scarce as rain in a desert. My completed chores were met with the same silent approval, the absence of criticism her highest form of compliment. But she had also started calling my work helping out. "Thanks for helping out with dinner, Lily," she'd say, as if I had chosen to do it, as if it wasn't the assumed end to my school day while my brothers locked themselves in their room to practice for a clan war. The phrase bothered me more than "be useful." Helping was a choice. This was a sentence. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. I had spent the entire afternoon making lasagna from scratch, a recipe I'd found in one of Mom's old cookbooks. It was a complicated, multi-step process. I browned the meat, simmered the sauce for an hour, mixed the cheese filling, and carefully layered everything in the pan. My hands were stained with tomato sauce, and a light dusting of flour covered my shirt. When I finally pulled it out of the oven, golden and bubbling, I felt a familiar flicker of that lonely pride. At dinner, my dad, a man of few words, took a large bite. He chewed slowly, then looked over at my mom. "It's good, Helen. Lily made it," Mom said, almost as an afterthought. Dad nodded in my direction, but his eyes were already drifting towards my brothers. "So, Jack, you were telling me about that tournament?" Jack's face lit up. "Yeah, me and Tom's team, we came in first in the regional qualifiers. We won $100 each." $100? Dad put his fork down. A real smile spread across his face. "Just for playing that game? That's my boy. Quick on the trigger, eh?" He clapped Jack on the shoulder and Jack beamed. "That's wonderful, dear," Mom said, her voice warm and genuinely proud. "See? All that practice paid off." I looked down at my plate. The lasagna, which had seemed so triumphant just moments before, now looked like a lumpy, sad pile of food. I had spent 3 hours making it. It had fed the family. It was the definition of useful. And it was invisible. Jack and Tom had spent the same 3 hours in front of a screen. And they were heroes. They had earned money. Their lazy activity was now a skill. My usefulness had earned me a distracted nod. The heat rose in my face again, that old, prickly resentment. But this time, it was mixed with something new. A cold, hard clarity. My mother wasn't trying to make me strong. She was teaching me how to be invisible. She was teaching me to accept a world where my work was the silent, uncredited backdrop for the adventures of others. She wasn't the warden of my prison. She was just another inmate, one who had been there so long she had forgotten the feel of the sun. Later that night, long after I had washed the lasagna pan and packed the leftovers away, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, the wall I had drawn as a child so vivid in my mind. But I no longer saw myself as the girl with the mop. I was a ghost. The next day at school, I didn't go to the cafeteria for lunch. I went to the library. It was quiet, and it smelled of old paper and possibilities. I sat down at one of the bulky beige computers in the back corner, and instead of doing homework, I opened the internet browser and typed, "how to make a website." It was a new world. It was a world of code, of strange-looking commands and symbols. It was confusing and frustrating, but it was a world built on rules, on logic, and I was good at following rules. For the first time, I felt a spark. This was a language I could learn. This was a galaxy I could build, line by painstaking line. It was a secret. It was mine. My brothers saved fake worlds with a controller. I was going to build a real one with a keyboard. If I was going to be useful, it would be on my own terms, in a world of my own creation. My secret world was built in the stolen hours of the night, after the dinner plates were washed and dried, after I finished my homework, and after the house fell into the deep silence of sleep. I would creep back out to the living room. The old family computer, a slow and clunky machine that my brothers had long since abandoned for their own sleeker models, became my starship. The dial-up modem's screeching handshake with the internet was the sound of my launch sequence. The first few months were a struggle. I learned about HTML, the skeleton that gave a web page its structure. I printed out tutorials from the school library and studied them under my desk lamp, the pages filled with my handwritten notes. My first website was clumsy and ugly. It had a bright purple background and clashing green text. It had a single picture of a cat that I'd found online. It was useless, but it was mine. I had made something exist where nothing existed before. My chores at home became a mindless routine. Mopping the floor, folding the laundry, setting the table, I performed these tasks with a detached efficiency. My body was in the kitchen, but my mind was debugging a line of code or trying to understand the logic of a CSS command. The resentment that used to burn so hot had cooled into a quiet resolve. The chores were no longer my identity. They were my camouflage. As long as I was the useful girl, no one would look too closely at what I was actually doing. No one would ask why I seemed a little more tired or why I spent so much time on the dinosaur computer. One night, I was deep into a tutorial about JavaScript, trying to make a button that would change color when you clicked it. It wasn't working. I had been staring at the screen for over an hour, my eyes burning. Frustration was building. I felt a familiar sting of inadequacy. Maybe Mom was right. Maybe I was just wasting my time on another silly game. "Lily, what are you still doing up?" I jumped, spinning around in my chair. Mom was standing in the doorway, her robe pulled tight around her, her face soft with sleep. The glow of the monitor cast a pale light on her confused expression. My heart hammered against my ribs. "I'm just finishing up some schoolwork," I lied. My hands flew to the keyboard, instinctively hitting the keys to close the browser window, but it was too slow. She walked closer, her eyes squinting at the screen full of strange symbols and colored text. "What is this? It doesn't look like homework." "It's for computer class," I said, the lie coming more easily this time. "It's an extra credit project. It's about website design." She stared at the screen for a moment longer. I could see she didn't understand it, not any more than she understood Jack and Tom's video games. To her, it was all just noise on a screen. She reached out and touched the top of the monitor, then ran her finger along the top edge, checking for dust. It was clean. I had dusted it that afternoon. She turned to me, and the suspicion in her eyes faded, replaced by that familiar, weary pity. "Don't stay up too late, honey. You'll be tired tomorrow. You have a lot to do." She left, pulling the living room door quietly shut behind her. I sat there for a full minute, my breath held in my chest. She hadn't understood. She hadn't seen a girl building a new world. She had only seen a girl who was supposed to be resting for a day of chores. The relief was so sharp it almost felt like disappointment. A part of me had wanted her to see, to understand, but I knew she couldn't. I turned back to the screen. The anger and frustration were gone, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. I found the mistake in my code, a single misplaced semicolon. I fixed it, saved the file, and refreshed the page. I clicked the button. It turned from blue to red. A huge smile spread across my face. It was a real, genuine smile, not the quiet, polite one I wore around the house. It was a small, silly thing, a color-changing button on an ugly web page that no one would ever see. But it was a victory. It was a spaceship I had launched myself. It was a battle I had won. In the years that followed, my skills grew. I learned new languages, new frameworks. I built more complex websites. I took on small freelance jobs I found online, designing simple pages for local businesses, earning my own money. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I saved it in a bank account my parents didn't know about. It was my escape fund. Jack and Tom graduated high school. Jack went to a community college for a business degree, his gaming tournament days behind him. Tom got a job at a big box electronics store, selling the very consoles he used to be obsessed with. They were still my brothers, but we were strangers, orbiting the same sun but in vastly different paths. Their adventures had fizzled out into ordinary life. Mine was just beginning. I was 17, a senior in high school, and I was no longer a ghost. I was an architect, and I was ready to build my way out. The letter arrived on a bright spring afternoon, the kind of day where the sun made everything look clean and new. It was a thick envelope, heavy with importance, from a university 3 states away. I had applied without telling anyone, using the money I'd earned to pay the application fee. I opened it with trembling hands in the privacy of my room. I'd been accepted into their computer science program, and I'd been offered a scholarship. It wasn't a full ride, but it was enough. Combined with my secret savings, it was my ticket out. The letter felt like a key, one I had forged myself. That evening, I waited until my father and brothers had dispersed after dinner, my dad to the TV, Jack and Tom to their respective rooms. Mom was in the kitchen, her back to me, her hands moving in the familiar rhythm of washing dishes. The clinking of plates and the running water had been the soundtrack to my life. I walked up to the counter and placed the acceptance letter on the dry patch beside the sink. "I need to show you something," I said. She glanced at it, then at me, wiping her hands on a towel. "What's this?" She picked it up and began to read. I watched her face, a canvas I had studied for 18 years. I saw confusion, then disbelief. Her eyes scanned the page again, her lips moving silently. "Computer science? A scholarship? What is this, Lily? Is this some kind of joke?" "It's not a joke," I said, my voice steady. "It's real. I've been accepted." "But how? I don't understand." The dam I had been building for a decade finally broke. I told her everything. I told her about the late nights on the old computer, the library tutorials, the ugly purple website. I told her about the freelance jobs, the secret bank account, the slow and steady work of building a skill that had nothing to do with clean floors or folded towels. I told her about the color-changing button and the victory I had felt. She sank into a kitchen chair, the letter still in her hand. She looked lost. "All this time," she whispered, "all this time I thought you were being good, being helpful." "I was," I said, and the words surprised me with their lack of anger. "But I was being useful for me, Mom. Not for the house. Not for anyone else. For me." I knelt in front of her, the same way she had knelt in front of me all those years ago, when she had told me it was different for boys. "You taught me that girls have to be useful to have worth," I said softly. "You were right in a way. I just disagreed with your definition of useful. To you, it meant being quiet, being helpful, being invisible. To me, it meant being smart. It meant being capable. It meant building something of my own so I would never have to depend on anyone else's approval." I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. It wasn't understanding, not yet. It was something more fragile. Respect. She looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time since I was a little girl drawing a family of sons. She saw not the child who was supposed to mop the floor, but a young woman who had drawn her own map and was now ready to follow it. She didn't cry. Helen wasn't a woman who cried. She just folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. "The world is hard on women, Lily," she said, her voice raspy. "I was just trying to prepare you." "I know," I said, "but you prepared me to survive in your world. I'm going to live in mine." 2 months later, as I packed my last box into the back of my used car, she stood on the porch watching. She didn't hug me. Instead, she handed me a small, lumpy paper bag. Inside was a lasagna, baked in a disposable tin foil pan. "For the road," she said, "so you don't have to stop." I smiled, a real smile. It was the most useful gift she had ever given me. As I drove away, I saw her in the rearview mirror, standing on the porch of the clean, quiet house. She didn't wave. She just watched as her daughter, who had once been taught to be useful, drove off to be powerful.